Hello and welcome to Perennial Podcast Episode 7. I'm here with Ken. How you doing, Ken?
Pretty good. How about yourself?
Not bad. So I watched Alternative Hypothesis Debate CV on Worski's channel on the reality of race. And I actually thought that alt-hype kind of failed in several respects in that debate. But and I was impressed actually by CV, who brought a lot of preparedness to the table. I think someone probably just asked, like, "Oh, do you want to jump in and do this, Ryan?" And he did. But it occurred to me while I was watching that it may be that white identitarians in the U.S. in particular stand to gain by accepting race denial, being that we have all these laws that disproportionately impact us. If we can say that, hey, I'm not preferentially hiring white people because white people don't exist, right? So if you just go along with this, you can sell your have your real estate complex sell only to whites, but don't say that they're whites. Like, oh no, these people are just interchangeable global humans. So what's the problem? I know it wouldn't work that way in practice, but I think it's a nice thought
hmm
experiment.
Yeah, the contradiction here is basically in the fact that uh, the egalitarian left believes that there is an extremely strong force in the world, which is racism, and this racism is basically founded on perhaps in-group preference. If you ask like the most literate psychologists among them, they'll say it's the in-group preference plus the color of the skin, and that's pretty much just it. And that formulation, they believe, has created this entire all-powerful white supremacist system. And it's funny because you get people who are kind of aware of this very contradictory system, and they'll say like, "Oh, if you criticize Jewish power, you're just as crazy as these people because they believe that there's this all powerful white supremacist system, and you believe there are these all powerful Jewish supremacists, and so you're just as crazy." And that's how contradictory it is that people will use it as a rhetorical play in argumentation. They'll say, "Oh, you're like the social justice warriors" or something like that. But the more intelligent ones, I think people who are just creative types, oddball types, they don't fit in with society. They see any kind of majoritarian attitude, any kind of conformist attitude or in-group preference as threatening to them. And so I think they see the issue of racism much more as this pragmatic thing of, well, if we attack racism as kind of the outer shell of the majoritarian, or you could say the authoritarian personality is another way to put it, then that will protect, in effect, the how does the phrase go? First, they came for the Catholics, and I did nothing because I wasn't a Catholic, so on and so forth down the line. The idea is, and I think from the Jewish perspective, it's like you protect blacks first, because blacks are the sort of canary in the coal mine in America traditionally, that if a white person is against blacks, oh, well, the next thing he's coming for is the Jews. So from that perspective, it makes sense, even if you don't totally buy into egalitarianism. And I've talked to people where they're like, no, I'm not a racial egalitarian, but I'm still against racism because I see it as ultimately threatening a creative minority, or I see it threatening me, or I see it threatening my family. So you can get all kinds of different people from different walks of life on board with the anti-racist platform because it's in their own self-interest. And whether it's justified or not justified, I mean, the brain makes up post hoc rationalizations for things that it sees as desirable. And so, to me, it shows the extent to which we are rooted in self-interest and emotionalism, that this is so wide, it's such a widespread meme, people take it for granted, it's very uncritically examined, and to examine it at all is really a taboo. So yeah, I mean, it's illustrative. The hypocrisies are illustrative of what's really going on.
So it might be a good thing just to throw back at someone who's attempting race denial you can always say, well, in that case, no more
Hmm.
affirmative action, right? But we did
Right,
have
right.
a more substantive topic in mind for today that Ken in particular was prepared to give a little intro to, which is inspired by the podcast we had with Ivan the Heathen on the topic of the death principle and the idea of breaking paradigms and how do these artistic innovations and evolutionary leaps happen, what motivates them. So, what I see here that Ken sent me is the principle of life as symmetry and death as differentiation. So, do you want to elaborate on that, Ken?
Right. So, a very simple thought experiment you can do when talking about life, biological life. What does all life have in common? This is like a basic question in biology. What is the definition of life? And it's reproducibility. Basically, if it reproduces and persists, it's considered living. Now, with viruses, that's kind of a sketchy case. Are they living organisms or not? But for the purpose of this discussion, we'll say that yes, even viruses are something which is self perpetuating. And you could go all down the line to say that molecular interactions, the way that perhaps two chemical compounds come into interaction, they form a third chemical compound, and that is a kind of reproducibility. So we can go down to the structure of atoms and quarks and as deep as you want. But this is the life principle, right? It's life is reproducing. If we remove that principle of reproducibility, if we imagined a world in which we remove the death principle, which says that if you do not reproduce, you are removed from life, you are no longer part of that set. If we imagine that, we could imagine all kinds of people who would be infertile, sterile, they could have multiple arms and legs, they could be missing parts of their body or whatever. And we can look at all kind of animal species and think that there would be a sort of infinite, many different kinds of life on Earth, that there would be this kind of infinite speciation. But in that infinity of speciation, there would really be nothing to differentiate one species from the next. They would all be equal. And this is, of course, what egalitarians want on a metaphysical level. They want to remove the death principle from the universe so that there is this infinite speciation. But what we understand from metaphysics is that if you truly had this kind of infinite speciation, you would really, in a sense, return back to oneness. I mean, you would very quickly have an organism which was R selective, like in a Borgian sense, like nanorobots, which just multiply at a rate of billions per second. They would quickly envelop the universe and there would be no space left. They would consume all the resources. That is what the removal of the death principle looks like. Now, the death principle in its absolute sense, like, you know, if you remove life, then there is no death principle to apply things to. So life is kind of primary in this sense. But as you remove the death principle, there is a sense in which there's a tension between life and death, which creates speciation. If you only have death, well, then there's no speciation because there's no life to speciate. But if you only have life, then once again, things sort of become a cosmic goo. Just in terms of mathematical modeling of how it would work, is everything would be a matrix of a matter which would be entirely consumed as living things which could not die. And so it was interesting when we were talking about like what does the life principle look like? How could we visualize that? And I offered the metaphor of a sphere, a perfect spherical object. And you can imagine that in the universe, that if all living things had no death principle, that the universe would just be one symmetrical sphere of, you know, viruses or some really basic thing, some reproducing thing. Whereas you apply the death principle, and that's sort of like the cuts and the permeations and how, you know, you cut a tree to allow it to grow. That is what those flaws, those attacks, and even metaphysical and spiritual attacks, demonic attacks, perversions, all of those exist as a pressure on life, which then responds by evolving, by differentiating, by speciating, and by, you know, rising to that challenge, by fitting into that niche. So the two exist, and they're basically necessary for one another for life as we know it to exist. And it's not just on the biological level, but we can also think about this in terms of our idea space. That if we are a cultural relativist who will say that all cultures are equal, all ideas are equal, or a moral nihilist, this person only has the life principle in their thinking. And it turns out to be a very boring ideology and a very weak one. When you apply the death principle and you say, no, there's some standard by which we judge ideas, that actually makes your ideas stronger and more powerful. Now, the opposite, I guess, would to be entirely negative about everything, to believe in nothing, and that would lead you right back to nihilism. So there's a kind of fire and ice at both extremes. You have this nihilism, and somewhere in the mean, the tension between the two actually creates evolution and power and complexity.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it would be fair to term the, as you term it, the death principle as the masculine principle and the life principle as the feminine. And the liberal ethos is about rejecting intolerance. So universal acceptance, which is kind of ironic because this is evidence of a feminine principle not living up to its biological purpose. So maybe it's kind of having in mind this kind of metaphysical ideal of everlasting life, with which especially, you know, liberals are theological in their mentality. They do have this kind of grandiose, otherworldly ideal that doesn't map exactly. But the feminine principle in biological practice is an instrument of selection, right? Only allowing certain members of the species to pass on to the next generation. So it's just interesting then that when you allow this feminine principle to take hold, it ultimately undercuts what defines femininity. And I think likewise, let's see if there's a parallel on the masculine side. So the masculine principle is not selection, but something like assertion. So it's not allowing in room, but it's rather a penetrating principle and inserting itself into a context. Now, if you practice universal intolerance instead of universal tolerance as the masculine principle, then you're never going to find yourself in a context into which you even want to penetrate in the first place. So this looks like the modern landscape. You have a bunch of male incels who we call them involuntary, but I think it's purely voluntary. They are sitting there, they're playing their video games, they're doing what they're doing because they don't want to assert themselves. They don't want to accept other contexts. So not living up to the masculine and females not living up to the feminine in that they're having all this sex, being very promiscuous, accepting all these men, but then ultimately not fulfilling the telos of the process. So I think, yeah, what you describe, we are seeing a failure of both the life principle and the death principle. And the natural tendency, because people tend to be polarized in their thinking, is going to be to double down on one or the other. And you do see this. You've seen men's rights and MGTOW. I think MGTOW is probably the archetype of that phenomenon where they take the masculine principle to its extreme and expect that they're going to find a solution to that. Because when you see feminism being propagated in the university and you're being lectured about it, and you're being lectured about your male privilege, your white privilege, whatever it is, you want to be extreme in the other direction. So that clearly is not the path, however. So what do you think then in terms of cutting a middle course? Because each of us, through a polarized lens, tends to see the extreme problem on one side or the other. What do we do to kind of maintain that balance?
Right. Well, it's interesting because if the basically you think of femininity as inviting everyone in, this total tolerance, then you can't distinguish someone who's going to hurt you from someone who's going to help you. On the other hand, the extreme masculine rejecting everything except yourself basically is libertarianism, right? So both the extreme left and the extreme libertarians, these people, and especially I see the atheists They want to reject all religion. It's like you couldn't find one good religion out of the however many millions of religions. You couldn't invent your own religion. Come on. Many people have done it before, so you're so smart, do it yourself. But they're like so emphatic. I reject all religions, and that is the ultimate intolerance. Although it's sometimes paradoxically paired with the liberal acceptance of all cultures or something. So there's a lot of contradictions here, but we can find roots of political ideology in these metaphysics. And so, if we were to have some kind of balance, it would have to be, I think, basically having a life principle in a sense that is organic, that works within a whole, that's not rejecting the death principle. It has to be basically a child-centered culture in a way, or at least that needs to be a significant part of the culture. Today, I think we have gone so far in constructing a culture where having children, forming a family, that sort of thing is seen as unnecessary or like a choice. It's like a lifestyle choice if you want to have kids. Whereas before, that was a prerequisite for being a part of society. If you were not doing that, then you needed to be part of a higher caste or a lower caste. You either needed to be a celibate priest, or you were some kind of outcast on the edges of society, or perhaps if you weren't fathering children personally, you were off as a warrior fathering many children with many women. So basically, the core of society was centered around the feminine principle of reproduction and childbirth. And on the fringes, you had all of these other outside castes. You had the priests and the warriors and vagabonds and whatever. So I think that's basically the way that you create a self-perpetuating dynamic relationship between the masculine and the feminine that's healthy, and that you have this constant interaction and constant compromise, essentially, or interplay between the extremes. Whereas now we have such atomization that the feminists can go over in this one corner and be as ultra tolerant as they want to be, and the masculine atheist libertarian can go over in his corner and LARP about extreme ideologies, LARP about extreme violence, extreme pornography. He can go into those hyper real fantasies, and the two never really interact with each other, even though they're living even within the same household. You might have a brother and a sister who are fitting into these archetypes. So it basically is all about bringing, and I say this not because I'm one to say like we need more kids as a pragmatic thing. I mean, automation is real. Technology is real. There are 7 billion people on the planet. So I'm not saying it in the sense that we need more people in order to achieve the goals that we want to achieve, but just that if you don't have men and women coming together out of this necessity of creating children, then they very quickly differentiate each other in ways that are unhealthy and don't jive with our evolutionary memory, which keeps these powers in check.
Right. Now, as you were speaking, I kind of called to mind an inversion of the type that occurs in this kind of polarization process, where you highlighted the behavior of the supposedly tolerant female, or feminists rather, and that struck me as like, they aren't tolerant. They're the most intolerant people. Whereas if you go to the far right, the most conservative, masculine minded sections of the internet, at least, people, yes, there are trolls and there are people being rude, but they are actually extraordinarily open. They will typically talk to anyone. So, Carl Jung talks about the anima and the animus, and how the male has a feminine aspect that's typically subconscious, and the action of the anima, in Carl Jung's term, in the male is something to do with like emotional projection. That's what Carl Jung says. Now, for the female, the animus is something like an erroneous projection of a sense of logic. Now, you look at the female who has femininity supposedly foremost in mind, and the interests of the female, this is going to evoke some kind of compensation mechanism. So the subconscious, when the conscious mind is myopic and one-sided, has to assert itself to maintain this balance of the organism. We're looking towards some kind of balance of the social organism, but the hypertrophy of the female strategy and the masculine strategy on both sides is preventing individuals from reaching this on their own. So we do need some kind of societal mechanism. But to do that, I think, yeah, we'll try to psychologize this a little bit more. So the female admires masculine institutions and power because that's proper and right. But with the propaganda that they receive, they start to resent that they are not in possession of this. And in school, with female teachers predominantly, they start to assume more and more of a masculine role and kind of forget the traditional notions of femininity. So all of this time, the animus, this projector of erroneous logic in the female, the masculine subconscious counterpoint to the conscious feminine orientation, is welling up and up to the point where it has developed in excess. So the actual visible characteristic of the extreme feminist is not a feminine one, it's a hyper-masculine one. So by focusing in on the feminine, they achieve an inversion of the masculine. And on the masculine side, these males, they, the people, like I can remember my own upbringing because I fit more or less into this category. I remember being propagandized that my group was bad, and I remember having groupish instincts well up. Now, over years, they did get suppressed again, but like around the time of middle school, when you're kind of coming of age and beginning to understand the power dynamics of the world to some extent, it was exactly at that point when I realized that systems of in-group were being constructed that positioned me outside of them. And so this was like, just like the feminine story involved resentment that they weren't living up to the masculine, the hyper-masculine story may involve not living up to the feminine of being that nucleus of the community and being part of that. And so there's a sense of alienation that resentment eventually builds into antisocial behavior. And but at the same time, what do you see in these libertarians, libertines, far-right people? Not to offend people who may be listening, but I think a lot of them are feminized. Now, there was, in the last maybe 5 years, kind of a reaction against that. And a lot of people are saying, get in the gym, get in the gym. But you look at these people's mannerisms, like someone like Richard Spencer. How effeminate can you get? Like, Richard Spencer is a very effeminate man. And he represents, now maybe you disagree, but I think so. So
I can't speak on this topic. Are you
I think, contractually forbidden from doing that?
Das Spook would have something to say about my ability to comment on the masculine versus feminine in men. But I think the way I see it is that women who feel like they've been abandoned by men, they still have this archetype of the masculine within them. And so they try to actually almost create the masculine within themselves. It's like we think of extreme personality disorder, like multi-personality disorder, as this thing that is only confined to a very small percentage of people. But I think that's really an extreme expression of something that a lot of people use as a coping mechanism. If you are lacking that extreme masculine principle in your life, then you kind of develop your own personality around that missing thing. So women who feel abandoned by their fathers, abandoned by society, they say, well, I'll be the man, I'll be selective, I'll be decisive, I'll be the CEO. And then men who feel like they've been abandoned by their mothers, they feel like they've been abandoned, rejected by women, then they kind of take on a female persona in order to...
Oh, we've lost Ken. I'll take this opportunity to highlight a thought that occurred to me just there. So the female interiorizes the desire for the masculine principle and, in effect, ends up projecting that onto others. I don't know if you've noticed this, but I have, where young women, especially like women in my generation coming up, would speak to their peers, who they perceived as being part of their in group, which is basically just people their age, with a very strong presumption that you share all of their political presuppositions. Like, it's this ignorance of the possibility of any ulterior logic at work, that's produced by this hypertrophic animus projecting their erroneous logic. So they internalize it and then project it outward into the interior of others. The masculine solution, in addition to what Ken just said, involves a projection. So it's, instead of withdrawing in and being concave, it's convex, it's protruding in a typically masculine fashion. And this lacking feminine ideal is found in pornography, I think, first and foremost, because of the sex drive, and then secondarily in what I see as extremely immature behavior in colleges with, groups of young men. And it's always been like this, but I think it's probably become exaggerated in recent years, in recent decades, where men, like in their early 20s, if they're in a group of men, they're infantilized around each other. And that represents kind of this, like, trying to recreate the feminine motherly inclusion, I guess, that they lacked as a child. But you got cut off, Ken, by your connection. Can you hear? Were you able to hear the whole time?
Yeah, I can hear you. No,
Okay.
I'm good. It's the cable's loose here on this camera. But yeah, people try to. I mean, there are basically two extremes of the coping mechanism. The one is to become that which you lack in your life as an external. You internalize the external which you lack, or it's to reject it, to fool yourself into believing that you don't really need it. So the two types are basically, you say, well, I don't have the other gender in my life. I don't have that organic connection. So I create it within myself. That's the transgender, basically. And you look at a lot of these people, it's like, what was your relationship with your parents? Go to the Stefan Molyneux route. And every time, I mean, there's very weird stuff going on there, very weird relationships. And they, as a coping mechanism, they internalize the other gender. Now, on the other hand, I think you do have people where they feel like they lack it in their lives. And so kind of they recognize that this is an unhealthy dynamic, but they don't want to own up to any flaws or insecurities or whatever. So they say, no, I'm totally a manly man. Or for a woman, you actually see some of these women, and they're less visible than the feminist, because the feminist is loud. They're in your face. They're trying to, I guess they don't have red pilling, but they're trying to blue pill you really hard. And, the other side of that is these girls who are like trying to become anime cosplay characters. They're like going for the hyper infantilization to the point where, I mean, some of these women on YouTube, Lauren Southern used to do the cosplay. Who's the other one? Brittany Venti. Like Brittany Venti is like trying to, the image of herself is like, I'm a little porcelain doll and I'm fake and I'm like a sex bot or something.
Yeah.
So there's both of these expressions in both directions. It's disturbing, but it's basically what happens when you sever that tie, you sever that bond. It starts with the parents, and then it's kind of a bigger thing of society, the lack of religion, the lack of community. I mean, and religion, metaphysically, psychologically, is so important for joining the genders together. And you think about all the, if you want to talk about gender play, the different depictions of Christ, the importance of the Mother Mary, all of that within Christianity, which, the feminist critique is it's a mono-gender thing, it's a patriarchal thing, but really there is an interplay of the genders, there's a joining of the genders within all successful religious systems, including Christianity. So to remove people from that, I think atheism is something that really produces these extreme types in people, where it's like they're either going hyper masculine, hyper feminine, or transgender, or something like that. They're not rooted in a connection to some traditional healthy sense of gender, and they have to go off in all these directions. I'm sort of thinking about some of the crazy stuff you had in the ancient world. I mean, you did have like these transgender priests, and you had like the oracle at Delphi, and you had like the myths of like an old woman who lives in a cave who's like she has like these sagging breasts but these engorged biceps, and there were all kinds of mythological conceptions of gender. We can talk about the Gorgon, the woman as a harpy. All of these ideas were within the cultural space. And it wasn't to say like, oh, you should become a harpy, or you should become a Gorgon, or you should become a cyclops. But these mythological archetypes existed, and they permeated the culture, and that psychic presence of them connected people to the extremes, so that they were not they were able to function in society. We're seeing a breakdown of people's ability to function in society. I mean, suicide is one of the most basic metrics of how that is rising, especially in the white population, especially in the older white population, like middle-aged white men. It's rising because people are disconnected from a series of things, and one of those disconnections is these extreme archetypes. I mean, why do people feel lonely? Why do they feel depressed and bored and this ennui of nothing's going on? Is because you don't have genuine connection to psychological extremes that's tried to be replaced with Hollywood pornography, Hollywood gore, and kind of shock emotionalist porn, but you're not actually connected to it on a deeper level. It's like a shock and awe tactic of like, if we just
Okay, so I guess the cord came loose again. One of the things I did want to pick up on in that was how women. Actually, he said so much after that I'm trying to remember what I was actually going to say. But it had to do with women. I'm going to go to what he just said. So he was talking about these extreme psychological gender projections in Greek mythology, and how they may have served as a kind of binding agent, allowing people to understand the spectrum and be a part of the spectrum authentically. What we have instead is people kind of not accepting that there are extremes. Like, oh, it's all a continuum. I'm not unusual. You have to accept me. Every point has to become the center. And I mean, that's why in Christianity, everything is centered around a male axis, an exclusively male pantheon, in order to provide that center, the pole around which femininity then has some kind of definition. Now, it's also, Greek civilization at that time, they practiced pederasty. There were a number of degenerating influences at work. So I'm not 100% sold on the let's portray the gender-bending gods in a positive light kind of message. But I mean, it's also present in Norse mythology.
It's not a positive message. It's not a positive. I mean, the medieval archetype of the witch was a gendered archetype. I mean, you had the warlock, but the witch was its own archetype. And now today we're not, allowed to call women witches, but it was something that as a totem pole, a god or a mythological creature is not something to be worshipped in a positive sense, but I think there's a kind of negative worship. Like you have an enmity, you have almost like a positive active enmity toward it. So
Absolutely.
That's kind of what I would advocate bringing back. Like, let's have the archetype of the thought as like a demonized archetype.
Yeah, and that is
we already have demonized archetypes.
Right. It's just that it's in a polarized sense where the left has their demon archetypes and the right has theirs. And, that's
Right.
extremely apt that religion is one of the major factors for joining the genders and setting their dynamics in some kind of equilibrium. So, um, you know, this is not something that can be solved lacking a recontextualization of our interaction with community. Because I think a lot of the time we, in an individualist culture, tend to think that this is my hero's journey. But I think that the political orientation that we've seen in the last few years is evidence that it's not about an individual psychological journey at this point, because balance needs to be returned to the community. So this is not an introspective, introverted hero's journey, but an extroverted one that must be embarked upon. And I think that it can only take place through the masculine, and perhaps that does have an internal initiation, but there we rely for our own psychological balance on embedding in a very concrete community, which is why I believe in hierarchy, I believe in religion, I believe in explicit institutional structures that put us in a common space and frame the dialectic. Because without that, we are in this polarized mode. So we have to create these spaces. We have to, as men, first of all, become masculine, and second of all, just forge the institutions that are necessary to bridge the gap. Now, I wish there was some psychological angle to take with women. I think this was kind of my mentality several years ago. And the only path that I can really see is through the New Age spirituality. And I kind of tinkered with that for a while because women are very attuned to those influences: Wicca, astrology, tarot, all of that stuff. And the reason is that they're lacking this kind of spiritual subordination. They're lacking spiritual guidance. So they look to it through these seemingly decentralized platforms and practices and this coven-like environment. So the question is, how do you convert a witch? Well, traditionally you don't convert them, you burn them. And that's troubling, Um, let's look at the chat, see if there's anything going on. So, warlocks, paganism is really just ancestral cult worship, honestly. Yeah, I think to a large extent it is. But I think more importantly, what these mythologies do is project the social landscape in an exaggerated form so that people understand their place in the community, so that they understand what archetypes they're supposed to live up to, so they know their place. Yeah, I think that's the real problem with why are we seeing this kind of extreme, like fleeing to the fringes of the masculine feminine spectrum, of the life death spectrum, because we lack a pole, we lack some kind of axis, something to ground the whole system on. Then there's some Chinese name that I can't read, so I'm not going to try. But the modern industrial era enabled liberals to bring in foreign barbarian peoples different from your own ancestral culture. Ironically, jet plane has destroyed Europe a lot. World War I and II, migrant crisis now. Yeah, so we're simply importing traditionally minded people. I think that might be a big part of why we want multiculturalism so badly, because we're not living up to our own archetypes, we're not fitting into our own roles, and we really do have a deep-seated craving for that tradition, so we have no choice but to just take it from the third world.
Okay, rap, thick gangster rays, really effeminate white men, and these really lily white girls. Why did they love the gangster rap? Why is it like the hardcore and the feminists who will listen to rap? and they'll really be into it, where the guy who's rapping is not a feminist at all. It's very apparent. They need this kind of archetype. And because of the racialized nature of our society, there is this get out of jail free pass if you're black. If you're black and you want to go against all the social norms, well, that's multiculturalism. So, really, what it means is, in effect, white people have been denied a culture. Now, white, and this is something else I wanted to go into, is does white culture exist? Well, yes, there's a sense in which you can say there is a white culture, but on the other hand, one of the first, you would think one of the first aspects of a culture would be self-recognition, that we are a culture. That would be the most superficial aspect of culture is, hey, I'm part of this culture. And you can't even recognize that. So there is a sense in which white culture is being abolished, and all of the positive, healthy, strength-giving aspects of that culture are abolished. But there still needs to be a space, there still needs to be an outlet for that. Otherwise, it's a pressure cooker waiting to explode. And basically, black gangster rap, and I've seen so many guys who, white guys who think of themselves as masculine, these white women who think of themselves as feminists or whatever, and they're like, this rapper is my most favorite artist, and you look up what they're about, their lyrics, their life story, it's like, this is in complete contradiction with who you are and where you come from. If a white person acted like this, you would call them a scumbag, you would hate them. But because they're black, it's acceptable. So again, there's these deep hypocrisies, deep contradictions, which must exist, because ultimately these psychological needs are more important than our need for rationality. The need for rationality is a very small part of a person's, hierarchy of needs. Most people really don't care about it. They say they care about it. Maybe in their academic subjects, they care about it to some extent in mathematics. But otherwise, 99% of your life, don't care about rationality. You care about satisfying, like, I need that masculine element in my life, and they find it in something like rap, which I think is really ridiculous, but I at least can understand it after, really being perplexed by it for a very long time.
The racial aspect makes it sacralized. So taboos, like you described with Greek mythology, taboos are acceptable in certain sacral contexts. So you can drink. I mean, in the Bronze Age, drinking was a ritual act in a ritual context. And then in the cult of Eleusis, probably taking hallucinogenics in a sacral context. And now the religion, the civic religion, is essentially black worship. That's kind of what it is. And so, like the wise magic black man talking, whatever they're saying, you're not in a logical, rational state. You're not in an ideological state. You're not in a political state. You're in a religious state if you're like indoctrinated into this cult, hypnotized by this cult. So, and that accounts for why, like, someone, if you ask them their political views, they can be completely antithetical to what, like, I don't know, Tupac had to say. I don't know contemporary rap, so I don't know the names to say. But they believe the opposite of what these artists, so-called, believe, and yet they're ardent followers of them. So I think, yeah, there's definitely, the females need this masculine archetype of domination, and males need to live up to that archetype, and so males vicariously live through that, but in a context where it's acceptable because it's part of this civic religion, and it's not something that you do, and that's typically the way these things go. Like the behavior of the gods in Greek mythology, people weren't expected to behave that way, but they did have those urges, and they really did benefit from seeing them fulfilled somewhere. And that's, especially the case with pornography and the way that's used. Like, we have these urges and we need to see them fulfilled somewhere in a way that doesn't touch on our personal taboos, and doesn't, we don't want to incur the sin ourselves, sin against the civic religion of anti-racism. So, it's definitely an unpleasant reality, but I think these psychological aspects are important, and if you want to come up with any solution, that sacral environment has to be taken into account. So women and men have been conditioned through school and through college, if they went to college, especially if they went to college, conditioned to reject our culture and conditioned to worship other cultures. And if you want to cut around that, the ideological course is only open to the, like, I don't know, 3% of the population who are still malleable enough, who have enough like elasticity cognitively to be open to persuasion. Most people, by the time they graduate college, they're not going to be persuaded. There's no persuading these people ideologically, but there is hypnotizing them, and there is speaking through art. So again, like we keep converging on these things that's the way the culture has basically gone. You look at this art being produced in the alt-right, and that's what made the victory in 2016 and everything, a lot of people like to say. But if you want to capitalize on this need and understand, like, women want strong men, and they want strong men in a way that is going to encounter resistance from their ideological fixations. So you have to cut through that with spirituality and with art. And that's what's the classic way to win over women. How do you woo ladies? Music, painting, these kinds of things, which aren't about logic, but you can embed in those things these subversive traditional masculine values. And I think ultimately the purpose of this, or the goal of this, would be to reassert masculinity in that kind of sacral context. And you can do it through existing religion. I think traditional Christians are tailor suited to address this need. I think a strong Christian man is exactly the kind of man that the atheist feminist really wants. And all they need is not to be a member of a liberal church, and to have a little bit more encouragement and faith in cutting through that. But then again, there's so few of those men and so many thoughts that why would they want to settle for the thought? So the only men who the thoughts really want are actually scarce and actually valuable, and it's not a good dating landscape, it looks like. Glad I'm married.
Yeah, well, I mean, you have a system where women have been given freedom of choice, and they can only make choices based off what they perceive, and what they perceive has been handed down to them as, like, this is good and this is bad. Like, Justin Bieber is good, or like this rapper is good, and so it's kind of like the inversion of the Disney princess, right? We talk about how in feminism you would say something like, well, the Disney princess creates an unrealistic expectation for women, and therefore men are perpetrating like this institutional violence against women because women aren't living up to this impossible ideal. But basically women have the same problem of, they have this prince who is like a billionaire, some famous guy. No man can live up to that, so they're eternally unsatisfied, and they're basically perpetrating a kind of psychic violence against men when they talk about how much they hate, this guy or that guy or something. Like the hatred that women have for men can be very, very sharp, and you could say there's a masculine quality to it, like a very sadistic quality to it. So, that is a product of, you have people who are given, who are not very good at making decisions, who have been given an ideology that points them in the wrong direction. So, like, how do you take existing people, especially women? I feel their neuroplasticity is it's different from men, in that on the one hand, they are more conformist, so you can kind of convince them of really stupid ideas a bit easier. But then once you convince them of that idea, like once they're really rooted in feminism, you can't argue them out of it, because again, it's not rational, it's not logical. To them, the idea of feminism is like a masculine principle in their life that they're clutching onto.
And sometimes
in the same way that you couldn't. Right.
explicitly
Go ahead.
explicitly it becomes anti-logical. Just this one point, like it's kind of
Yeah.
like an intellectual trap because they get into it through reason,
Hmm.
and then it explicitly
Hmm.
rejects reason as masculine.
Yeah, it's interesting, but basically, because they were not, I don't think they were actually argued into it. I think they accepted it basically as a conformist function of their psychology. And so you can't argue them out of it. The only thing you could do would be to place them in a novel environment. For instance, you have feminists who have converted to Islam. Like, this is a real documented phenomenon. So Islam has a solution to the problem of feminism, and it doesn't look like argumentation. It doesn't look like rational, reasonable arguments against feminism. It looks like, 12th century, barbaric activity. I mean, it just is what it is. Women see that. They feel they have this gravitation toward it. It is culturally acceptable in the civic religion because of the quote unquote racialized aspect, even though theoretically you could have a white Muslim man who could do the same thing, right? So there is a solution, but basically white people are not allowed to do that. If white people theoretically did convert to Islam, Islam would become demonized overnight. I mean, so the idea that that is somehow a one cool trick to get out of the problem is ignoring the reason how these ideas become taboo in the first place. Like, who is creating a taboo? Who has control of the flow of taboo? And what are their interests? Okay, well, if white people converted to Islam, they would just start saying that Islam is bad in the same way that white supremacy is bad. So again, you have to address the deeper problem of, who creates the meme and what is their interest in meme creation. What are they trying to do fundamentally? What is their identity, which they're trying to protect and promote? So you understand that, and then it's like, okay, Islam is like, a lot of people would hear this, like, oh, Islam converts feminists into like trad wives, so we should all become Muslim. No, that's not a solution to the problem. It's just saying that it would be really easy to solve the problem of feminism if we were allowed to do it. The problem is we have, as you said, a civic religion created by certain interests who are not going to allow it under any branding, whether you call it Christian patriarchy, Islamic patriarchy, whatever patriarchy you want. They're going to allow it for non-whites. They're going to deny it to white people. It doesn't matter if you're white Muslims or white Christians. It's all going to be the same thing. So we really have to address that underlying. How do you remove yourself from that mimetic system, and how do you enter into a different mimetic system? And that ultimately is art and community.
Mm-hmm.
As you said, I think the election, it was all about how do we create Keck or Donald Trump? How do we create these false gods that everyone kind of ironically knows is a joke? But people really were like, I'm an atheist and I can't get around the problem of religion, but I can pretend for a moment that I believe in the God Emperor. I can pretend that I believe in Keck. And this is somehow like, it's porn, it's religious porn. It's like, oh, now I can be like a religious fanatic for the first time in your life. And I think some of these people, like, they felt for the first time in their lives what it was like to be religious, even if it was fake. In the same way that they're, masturbating to porn, even though they know it's fake, they're still doing it. They're still getting a rise out of it. So we've reached a point in politics where, yeah, politics is masturbation, politics is pornography, and so that's the emotionalist space we're dwelling in. The question is, do you want to buy into that and become successful within that emotionalist space, or do you want to create a new aesthetics? And that has to basically be centered around community. So a lot of the people, they're going for the emotionalism and kind of rejecting the community, because community is a lot harder to form, to actually have stable relationships with people, within a given space. But
Yeah.
those are basically the two options.
Yep. Um, and the fact that these feminists have converted to Islam does support again that fact that it's the sacral context that opens modern women up to true conversion. So they need something spiritual, and that is helpful if it's, provided within a communitarian context, just because of the way that mind control works. Like if you're around people and you're standing up and you're sitting down at the same time, if you're, all having the same gestures, then you're going to be more receptive to thinking along similar lines. And that's why, at that moment at Charlottesville with the Tiki Torch march, there was a sense that, like, okay, actually, wait, they're doing something right here. Now, the next day didn't go so well, but, there is definitely a serious power to ritual, which gets into Shadowfire 0001, kind of rejecting this notion in the current context, saying, given the degradation of traditional hierarchical religious institutions, like what has befallen Rome since Vatican II, does it benefit men and women to join, pardon the expression, cucked organizations? I don't think that we can join liberal churches, but there are still traditional people in the Catholic Church, and the Orthodox Church, for the most part, is still pretty good. So that's why I go to Catholic Mass. That's what I do. That's my ritual. And a lot of Catholic, like if you're a young Catholic male, I think you have a lot of good options. You have much better options than if you're not a young Catholic male, I think. I respect their historic adherence to the natural law, but Evola and others theorized the best way to handle the Kali Yuga of the modern era was a form of individual traditionalist spirituality. Right. I too read Men Among the Ruins, so there's an element of truth to that, but he was also anticipating social collapse and, maintaining either just by yourself or with a group, a small like monastic type order. If I recall correctly, that is what Evola advocated, kind of like the wise men on the mountains, being like the people to bring civilization back and bring the perennial tradition back to that's why it's called Men Among the Ruins, right? Well, I mean, you can't do that absolutely on your own, and it's questionable how large of a group you actually need. So I'm not as much of a pessimist as Evola in that respect. I think that you should try to scale this. I think you should try to, figure it out for yourself. And that's what I do. So what I believe is the right path is to sort out the metaphysical and spiritual questions yourself, determine what you believe the truth to be, and then argue with others to settle that matter and to reach a consensus. Now, the problem is not a lot of people even think about it, and very few people are equipped to argue about it, and they don't feel confident arguing about it. And then even if you argue about it and it seems from one side that you've, broken through a given point, just the way people are, we're very prideful and, not accepting of that, which the comment section is where a lot of stuff happens. A lot of forum activity goes on, not as much spoken word activity, spoken word conversation as is necessary for really formulating this metaphysical consensus. That's what I think is necessary. If that's a monastic context and that's it, fine. If it's a church, all the better, and you can scale that. And that's what I'd rather do, especially since we don't know if we're actually going to reach that social collapse stage. I mean, it very well may be that the technocrats know what they're doing and they're really going to convert into a whole kind of global government, technocracy, mega cities, controlled reproduction, AI replacement, like that. The whole kit and caboodle could happen. And if you're just on your own meditating or whatever, I think you're missing the point, because I think the role of spirituality is holistic. It can't just be introverted, or else you're doing it wrong. I'm positive of that. And then it seems like modern religious expression subverts the traditional male-female archetypes. Much of modern religious expression does subvert those archetypes. But even Protestants, as long as they're biblical literalists, like go to an independent Baptist church, if they are hardline biblical literalists, they have to accept that the woman is supposed to obey the husband. And that's, just that fact of like this misguided principle of biblical exegesis from the early 1900s, late 1800s, that accident has probably maintained a lot of social stability. We probably would have accelerated into all this dichotomization, polarization, feminism, hypermasculinity, all of that garbage a lot faster, if not for that. So I try to at least be grateful, even if they're wrong about certain things.
Right. It's like if you introduce, if someone is not very intelligent and you give them a very intellectual, convoluted lie, they're not going to understand the lie. They're just going to keep with what they know, which is like, not well justified in their mind, but it's probably better than the lie. Whereas someone who's really smart will say, oh, this is like something higher. This is something above the idiocy of the people around me. So I'm going to gravitate toward the lie simply because of its complexity and the social elevation connected with it. So I think, yeah, I mean, it's interesting. You look at like the 19th century, like the castrati, the history of how in the church women were not allowed to sing because singing could be interpreted as a type of talking, and women weren't allowed to talk in church. So it was an extreme thing. It always boggles the mind if I walk into a Christian church and I hear a female pastor, or even like the woman getting up to read the Bible. I'm thinking like, okay, if I just forget what I've read in the Bible, I can kind of see the function of like, oh, you have the male priest and then you have the woman reading it or something. But then I'm like, but you guys have read the Bible, right? I mean, you're Christians, right? So you should understand what's going on here. But it's very strange. Like they'll say things like, well, homosexuality isn't explicitly prohibited in the New Testament or something like that. But it's like the women not talking in church is like very explicitly prohibited. So I don't know. At that point, it becomes like, well, the Bible was made by flawed people, but really Jesus was a good guy but people just took him later. And yeah, that gets into a whole thing there. But yeah, I mean, basically, the fact that if you look at the IQ of people, if you imagine like let's say the elite who are trying to bring in this technocratic system, let's say they have an IQ of 140, they can effectively communicate and change the minds of the 120 population. They can kind of control that managerial class. The IQ 100 and below, they can't really reach. The IQ 100 and below are just going to kind of go with what tradition says, with what their parents and their grandparents says. They're pretty hard to move. The best thing you can do to manipulate someone with an IQ of 100 and below is you have to directly appeal to their emotional interests, their hedonic impulses. But even then, people are so good at maintaining contradictions and cognitive dissonance that they can be hedonistic and still hold like certain traditional views on sexuality. And that is of course contradictory, but that's just the way people work. So I do believe that the system as it's set up now has a lot of inertia. I'm not a pessimist in the sense that I don't think a societal collapse is coming and then the men among the ruins are going to emerge and teach everyone the right way to do things. So I'm like a perverse optimist in that I think the system as it is going to keep going in the direction it's going. And I think that people have an obligation to not go the Ted Kaczynski route and hide in the woods. I think that's basically the cowardly way out. I think that if you really want to be, I mean, if Ola was alive and he said, we should have this individual spiritual journey, I would say, fine, have an individual spiritual journey. But to truly define yourself as an individual, you have to be juxtaposed against a world which you create your individuality by interacting with that world. If you go, hide yourself away somewhere and you're not interacting with the world, you're not actually creating your own individualization. So I really think that the best way, like if you were really to take this solipsistic position that there's nothing we can do and, we should just focus on ourselves. Well, the best way to build yourself up spiritually is to come into contact with your opposite, in the same way that the best way to build yourself up physically is not to give your muscles lots of rest and relaxation. It's to confront them with that which is opposite to them. Your muscles are a force generating machine. They pick things up and put things down, and the weight is something which resists the activity of your muscles. So spiritually, your spiritual activity, you should put it up against resistance. And so even if you were to say everything is hopeless, everything's useless, we should just go hide in the mountains, I would say, well, the real mountain is not that geographical, physical, geological mountain. It's the mountain of postmodernism that is right outside your door, or it's right inside your laptop or your phone or something. It's staring you in the face. So go live in that wilderness, go live in that mountain and struggle with that. I mean, early monastics, I'll just make this final point, that they had all kinds of fever dreams. And I'm speaking specifically about Egypt in like the 4th century. The early monastics recorded all these fever dreams where they would be fighting with devils, where succubi would come and try to seduce them with food and sex, and they come attack them and ensnare them and do all this stuff. And they said that this process of engaging and fighting with the demons was necessary in order to achieve spiritual purification. So if you just say, well, I'm going to be a conservative Christian, I'm going to go live off in the boonies and have my own Christian family, I would say you're not really doing what Evola ultimately was asking for, which was this spiritual purification. That can only be achieved by engaging with postmodernism. That's my take.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I know I've definitely taken a more escapist route in the past, and it's definitely a relief, just like giving your muscles a rest is a relief at first, but then you become lethargic and it becomes difficult to get back on track. So I think really like in terms of individual spiritual health and development, just being a normal person, having a job, going to work, going to church, seeing your family, like being well adjusted, just like up to a normal standard, that's more than enough. Anything beyond that, trying to be a spiritual Superman in this day and age, in this context, just seems like you're probably going to be LARPing and you're probably going to be doing more harm than good. Now, on the other hand, though, I mean, the world does need a Superman of some kind to come along and
Right.
save the day. But maybe that new spirituality that we need, the new church, does need to look more like, not led by, first we had the reign of god kings, then we had the reign of priests, then warriors, then merchants, and it's going to be the 4th turning. The Kali Yuga is it's the rule of democracy, rule of the average man. So we need the church of the average man, and just say like, we don't really know for sure. We're trying our best. We're going to get together and like have lunch or something.
Well, yeah, that's what Nietzsche said, basically, right? That you would get to this point. So yeah, I can't endorse that. I have to say, I mean, maybe this just reflects my own radicalized nature or something, that I just want to say, like, look, you have this one iteration of your life, like throw yourself into the trenches, throw yourself into the front lines, like don't be afraid of the incoming bullets. Like, sure, if you engage with postmodernism, you're going to get scratched up, and some people are destroyed. I mean, drug addiction is real. Okay, so if you engage with drugs, some people they go on a downward spiral, or you're okay with it, then you hit a depressive point, you lost your job, you lost your wife, and now all of a sudden you're an alcoholic or whatever. Opiates are the big thing right now. So, I mean, there's always danger in that. So I'm not saying that like this is risk-free, and I'm not saying that this is like the safest bet. Obviously, the safest bet is like, I would say, like, join the Mormons, join the Amish, like go to Siberia. I don't know. Like, there are options for forming healthy families in the current year, but that's not what I advocate in terms. It's like, obviously, if there's a war going on, there are options for peace. I mean, if you look at Syria, there are people in Syria, they're fighting a war. You can leave Syria. But if I was a Syrian, I would be like, no way, I'm not leaving Syria. I'm fighting for my country. And so that's kind of how I view it, is that you have to be like, look, there are options for safety, and some people need to take those options just because they don't have that fighting spirit or whatever. But I guess I've always been a contrarian, so I've always been of the belief that, like, if there's a battle going on, you need to go out and seek it, you need to fight it, you need to engage with it. And obviously that's like going to result in damage done to you, but you're doing it on behalf of your own purification, your own shot at enlightenment, perhaps,
Yeah.
or you're doing it for the sake of other people around you.
Well,
So
yeah,
someone has to do it.
I do think, and I was being quite literal when I said like the new church would be admitting our fallibility and like being a lot more humble about
Mm-hmm.
it. Because you look at what did religion begin with? Literally, there were one class of people, probably one race of people, telling other races of
Mm-hmm.
people that we are gods and this is how to
Mm-hmm.
live. And here's our
Yeah.
husbandry and our agriculture. And it descended through the
Mm-hmm.
classes until like we have absorbed this material. Anyone can go to the bookstore and buy and the works of Evola. They can go on Amazon and read Guénon and read all this stuff. They read the Vedas. Like nothing is a cult. Nothing is truly a cult in this age, which means it is kind of this the religion of the common man is waiting to be created, and that doesn't have to be an insincere thing. I mean, it might be ironic at the same time, but it could
Mm-hmm.
be maybe more sincere and more earnest. And I do view the cycle of
It's
the
interesting.
ages in a kind of progressive way as well. Before I go on, what do you have to say?
Oh, just it's interesting when you said there's no real cults, because these perennialist works are available to anyone who wants to buy them off the shelf. And so there's a sense in which that is true, but then I'm looking at it from a gradualist perspective of, there are these IQ barriers, and there are like interest barriers, agency barriers. And so, when Alex Jones talks about the Bilderbergers or the Illuminati or something, I'm like, well, he's a little bit far out there, but I do believe that the world is ultimately controlled by people who have a cultic mind frame. Now, how that organizes itself, what is their name? I don't care about that at all. I'm not interested in going to Bohemian Grove and filming like the Festival of Spring where they worship a wooden owl. Like, I don't care about the structure that it takes out there. I mean, I'm interested in perhaps studying, what is the person's relationship to symbology. I think as an artistic endeavor, that's interesting. But I think basically the cultic mindset, like if you're watching the video, you are within some layer of initiation. You're not in the most deep levels of some elite, because anyone can watch this video, but in a gradualist sense, you are likely to be on some higher level than your average fellow man. And so I balk at the idea. Like, I get the thing about admitting the fallacies, like saying like, look, we live in a postmodern world. People who profess themselves to be spiritually and morally pure are often, very, very often, turn out to be deeply hypocritical people.
Yeah.
The louder that you proclaim your moral purity, the more likely it is you're covering up for some like egregious sin you're doing on a regular basis. So I think there's definitely something important there, but I think there still is there still are moral intellectual hierarchies that create like levels of initiation that I'm probably not even aware of, but some of them we can see within the context we're operating in right now.
Yeah, and I mean, we talked about this last stream, and the importance of, I mean, we're literally saying let's emulate the Illuminati. So clearly, I'm on that same page in certain respects, and I like paradox, I like antinomy, and I think that is these two elements of religion do need to be reconciled somehow, and I'll just leave it to the imagination how that might be accomplished. Um, So I wanted to respond to one of the comments. Yeah, apostate. Uh, he says the degradation is necessary in defining the fall of man in the Kali Yuga. Nobody really reads anything. So I guess he's just kind of saying like it's going to happen, similar to the sentiment that was expressed above by Shadowfire. And I think I don't put that much faith in a literal interpretation of the myth of the yugas, the myth of the ages. Like, clearly, there is a factual basis to it, but I'm not certain that it's going to go the way they foresaw. I mean, and it's always possible that the golden age begins through your own conscious effort. And I also believe that it's possible to miss a golden age. I think that, like, I don't think these things are historically determined or deterministic. I really do believe, and I have metaphysical reasons for that. I really do believe it's open to influence by our will, notwithstanding that there are probabilistic trends set up by these social historical currents. But anyway, I don't have such extreme faith where I would just allow degeneracy and even possibly encourage degeneracy if you're like an accelerationist or something. I wouldn't do that, because what if us as a planet moving into a better way, a more perennial way, a more life affirming, soul affirming, God affirming way, what if that depends on me trying to be honest and good? And I just feel like, the defeatism is not really the point of Evola, in my opinion. Not, I didn't read Ride the Tiger, so I'm not sure about his practical advice. I read Men Among the Ruins, and I read Revolt Against the Modern World. So I'm kind of missing that. What does Evola actually, in concrete terms, recommend to the individual? And that's Ride the Tiger, so I don't know. And then in regards to, this is still apostate, in regards to femininity, the entirety of downward orientation of power in many Protestant churches is inherently degenerate and effeminate. Yeah, I mean, the structure of Protestantism is telluric, is downward focused, but I mean, you do have like the Southern Baptist Convention, where even when, if you keep biblical literalism, these people, they may kind of descend and decentralize, but they also have a tendency to reformulate and build new power structures. So I'm not entirely giving up on Protestantism. I went to a Baptist church for, I don't know, it's probably about a year, when I lived in Arkansas, and I went to a Baptist church down the road here a couple times. And Protestantism does have its virtues, and there is this kind of like simple man, common man virtue that Protestants and the lower classes have. And I was born into a relatively low class family, so it's not like I'm talking from a position of social superiority when I'm saying this, but there is a virtue that class has to realize. And if you look at, the far right, the dissident right, they are working class by and large. They're not middle class people who make up the bulk of the movement. They're not hyper educated. The educated elite tend to be gravitating towards this kind of like pseudo intellectualism, where they read a few books by Evola and Guénon, and like then look down on people who are actually philosophically literate. But that's just, my comment on that. Then a really famous Catholic story is when Saint Benedict was sent prostitutes by jealous laity. Damn Italians. Yeah, I mean, I'll definitely get behind that. I I didn't like Italians for the longest time, but I guess Nick Fuentes is Italian mostly, so I don't know what to do. I've never liked Italians, but I like Nick, so I'm really torn.
Yeah, well, he's I don't know how much percentage Italian he actually is, but he likes to kind of latch on to that, which is funny. But I don't know. I don't know. Italians, they just had an election where everyone's excited about it, and I'm like, again, how many times do we have to kind of reinvent the wheel before people understand the political process? Like, you had Brexit, you had the election of Donald Trump, and now something's happening in Italy. They have a new government. Again, there's deeper forces at work. So like, I don't know. It maybe I always say, like, at this point, I'm not saying give up on politics. Like, you can engage with politics, but engage in it with maybe it's an aristocratic sense where you're sort of apathetically working through it. I mean, in the same way, if you practice a sport, you don't throw down, your baseball bat or your racket or whatever. You don't have a temper tantrum every time you lose a match. And also, you're not necessarily king of the world when you win. You don't like go wild when you win. So there has to be some kind of temperance to this. And it's disappointing when I see people get so excited about these things and then they're setting themselves up to be like, oh man, however many months or years it takes, they get depressed about it. They get disengaged. I'm saying this is not a productive cycle to get really super involved in politics to the point where it's like life or death. And then after you win and you realize that winning didn't really amount to much of anything, you're like, I'm leaving the movement because this wasn't what I expected. I thought you promised me victory and it was this and that. So I'm just saying, like, politics is a lower level of interaction with reality than things like culture and religion and these deeper ideas. You can call that metapolitics if you want. I just say it's organization on a deeper level rather than a superficial expressive level. That's what I think about Italians at the moment. Could probably go into an entire Let's do an anthropological podcast for each one of the European nations, just focusing on the gender archetypes and
we can do that.
All the history and whatnot.
I would like to do that. Now, there's a request for a physiognomic analysis of Gary in Mendham, so I'll pull that up. And we'll take
I was actually thinking about that recently. He has some pretty Nordic features.
Oh yeah,
in fact, he like strikes me as I don't know what his actual national background is, but he strikes me as pretty either Swedish, Norwegian, Danish, that circle of Scandinavian. If he actually cut his hair short, he would probably look either like some homeless fisherman I've met, or just like, I mean, he's very tan, and just he has this attitude. I tried to watch some video with him recently, where he's just like so earthy and grounded, but he tries to do it in this extremely clear-cut, genuine way, like no bullshit, just the pure truth. And I don't know what to say about him. Never interacted with him. He's always been on the periphery of like every single YouTuber I've ever actually interacted with. So it's like he's always that head poking out in the corner, like shouting something, and I'm like, oh, there's a guy shouting over there. But
I vaguely remember this, like, and I can't remember if you have those memories like way back where it's almost like you don't believe it actually happened. But before I even watched any YouTube videos at all, I remember this news report about Gary, about in Mendham, about how there's this like YouTuber trying to create a cult of death, and he was encouraging people to kill himself. And like I have a very distinct memory of that. I don't know if somebody could find the news report, or if it even was Gary. If there was some other YouTuber cult of death person encouraging people to kill themselves, then that's depressing. But so his actual his physiognomy, I'm looking. He has very wide eyes. But also deep-set eyes. And Schopenhauer believed that if you have like wide eyes, you're probably pretty intelligent. It's like an indication of receptivity. sensitivity. He has a sensitive look about him in a certain respect, and very light eyes, but also like kind of a brute look in another way, where his bone structure is just like so just out there and brutally honest that there's no, he doesn't even have like excess skin or fat on his cheeks. He's just he's a skeleton at a certain level, but like well
Yeah.
formed. He has a noble look about him. I do think he's in earnest. For a while, I kind of wondered whether he couldn't be some kind of psyop, but I don't think so. I think he definitely is in earnest, and but he also looks narrow-minded. So he has a
Mm.
tall head, which to me indicates spirituality, but his head is fairly narrow, which to me indicates narrow-mindedness. And he's been fixated on this topic, which granted he believes
Mm.
is the most important topic in the world, suffering, and he's right. And I don't disagree with Gary on a lot of things. He's on the right track to the perennial ethos. He just kind of doesn't trust in tradition and is selfish and self-oriented, so doesn't see like the utility of some people being life affirming and the appropriate people being life denying. Um, and I think there were a couple comments more that I wanted to.
Mm-hmm.
Apostate tells me to read Hegel. Now, I'm reading Husserl at the moment, and to me that just seems more relevant to what I'm trying to do in my own philosophical method. Schopenhauer criticizes Hegel so intensely that I have kind of like a stigma built up in my mind. It's not like I'm not familiar with Hegel's basic ideas, and I'm aware that he's kind of impenetrable. And I've watched video lectures and stuff on him, but I mean, if you can give me a compelling reason why Hegel's actually useful. I know that Marx used a lot of Hegelian thought and dialectics in his historical approach. But yeah, I mean, make the case for it, and maybe I'll add it to the list. And that's caught up. So I don't know if you can tell, my throat's getting super scratchy, so maybe we can start heading towards the end. So,
Sure.
if you've watched this for a while, maybe hit the like button. And, if somebody does want to jump in and take the jump into the Discord and be brave, then I'll stick around for that. But we'll give it like another 10 minutes and kind of just finish up our thoughts. Okay, Apostate is now saying he hasn't finished Hegel yet, but he's telling me to read it. So, all right. If anyone does want to hop in the Discord, feel free. That's there. The link should be in the description. But, let's try to recap. We were talking about the life principle and death principle, life being femininity, death being masculinity. We talked about the anima and animus and the process of polarization compensated by a subconscious process of hypertrophy of both the animus and the anima, resulting in extreme antisocial behavior on the one hand on the masculine side, and then extreme openness to the point where they hate a lack of openness. But neither of these sides are actually coherent. The hypermasculine archetype embodied in like libertarianism and dissident right, far right people, like they're often very effeminate, e.g. Richard Spencer. And then on the female side of things, you have people who are so open that they hate anyone that disagrees with them, which is paradoxical. But we talked a little bit about how these things could be resolved. And basically, it's the same thing that we've been saying for a while now. We need a church, we need structure, we need a coherent mythology. And then we went into a little bit about what that might look like. But what can you add to that to kind of put a cap on this, Ken?
Yeah. At the end of the day, all of this what we're trying to break down here is dichotomies or juxtapositions that you can use as references to understand reality. I think from any point of view, whether you agree with the direction we're going in or not, and understanding and making sense of this is so important as an individual. I felt very confused about all of these topics for a very long time until I came to understand, okay, it's not just, I mean, people will present things sometimes in a way in which, like, they'll present left versus right, and that is the universe is divided into tax cuts for the rich and welfarism or something like that. And if you're so narrow-minded into those kind of dichotomies, which do exist, like all linguistic representation in a way is forming little dichotomies. But if you're so narrow-minded, stuck in that stuff, the world is going to be confusing. You're going to feel like this little dot in a universe that you can't quite perceive or grasp. Whereas when you kind of zoom out to metaphysics, the practical application, I feel, is that you understand the space around you. You understand the space within you. You understand your own personality better. If you understand your strengths, weaknesses, limitations, potentialities, then you're going to be able to better do whatever it is you're trying to do. Now, of course, we would like you to come help us or to guide us if you think you have more knowledge in one area or another. But whatever the case is, it's not just intellectual fluff. It's practical, bare bones, trying to get to the deepest levels, starting with something like life and death. From there, you build a theory of morality, you build a theory of gender. You come to see how these things evolved biologically over time, why they exist, why they're presently under attack, what their function is, and what the counter function of society is against them, what spaces they're allowed to exist in, what spaces they're not allowed to exist in, the racial angle, and all of that. Whether or not you feel like you can do something or not, a solution has to come out of a deep understanding. So start from that position of deep understanding. Don't start from a superficial level of just I don't know, we have to be pro-white, and that's like the end of the conversation. It has to be something much like, what is whiteness at its fundamental core? What metaphysical qualities define whiteness? If we understand those qualities, then you can go build yourself up to finally achieving some kind of political expression of whiteness. And to the extent that the alt-right has been successful, it has done so on an intuitive understanding of a lot of these things. Perhaps some people do have a deeper level understanding. But I think when we're talking about art, the creation of memes, it's basically someone intuits some metaphysical form, they represent it, and then other people receive it, and then they intuit what that means without necessarily having analytically processed all of the potential information in there. So it is useful, and that's pretty much all I have to say for the recap.
All right, and I think that will go ahead and wrap it up. Yeah, I'm hoping that one day someone will have the courage to come on the stream. It's so tiny. Yeah. That's the thing. There are 18 people watching right now. It's not a lot of pressure, in my opinion, and I think that we could all benefit from more dialogue. But I will get some other guests on soon. And are we doing Saturday, Ken?
Das Boot.
Yeah, we do have another engagement with Das Boot.
That's all. I'm just going to say, if you watch the Das Boot podcast, he is braver than all of you who are not joining in right now. So that's my chastisement for tonight. I should be good for Saturday, and we'll talk about more of that after the show.
All right. So that's the plan. I see some people are saying that they will jump on. And, now we're ending. But next time, then, we'll try to hold you to that. Apostate and John C. Is that John Cena that's messaging us now?
John Cena.
Anyway, have a good one, guys.